All right, so good afternoon. Welcome to this panel discussion on 20 years after Oslo, where next for U.S. policy. My name's Tom Bowden. I'm an analyst with the Ayn Rand Institute. On behalf of the Institute, I'd like to thank the Middle East Forum Education Fund for its generous grant in support of this event. Now, we're getting started, according to my watch, at 12:14. And my goal is to keep us within a 90-minute time frame and be finished by 90 minutes from now. So we're here today to talk about how the world has changed and how it stayed the same in the 2 decades since the Oslo Accords. You've all seen that famous photograph of Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands with Yasser Arafat. Nearly 20 years ago to the day here, September 13th, 1993. And those two are embraced by an almost angelic Bill Clinton who's spreading his arms wide as if to confer his blessing. In defining the scope of this event, we've identified 3 issues that I'm going to name briefly. But of course, the panelists can address them in whatever order and whatever length that their own discretion dictates within their allotted time. And of course, the Syria crisis is looming large, and we'll certainly be touching on that today. So to start with some historical background, we're here 20 years after the American-led peace process sparked a lot of hope about Middle East peace, but that policy has collapsed and peace remains elusive. So what explains that history of failure? A second issue is this. Right now, with the rise of Islamists, the upheaval in Egypt, the Syrian civil war, and an imminently nuclear-capable Iran, what might it actually take to achieve peace in the Middle East? And then finally, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, how should we view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And broadly, what should American policy be toward the region going forward? Now, I'm pleased to introduce our panel for today. Everybody should have a program. It's a one-sheet program with more details on these gentlemen. If you don't have that program, Lynn in the back of the room has copies, and you can get them from her. I'll start with Aaron David Miller to my immediate left. He is Vice President for New Initiatives and Distinguished Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars here in Washington, D.C. His latest book is The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. Our next panelist, Daniel Pipes, President of the Middle East Forum, a think tank located in Philadelphia, founded in the 1990s for the purpose of promoting American interests in the Middle East and protecting Western values from Middle Eastern threats. He's a columnist for the National Review and newspapers around the world. Third panelist, Jonathan Tobin, who is senior online editor of Commentary Magazine and an award-winning journalist, commentator, and arts critic. And finally, we have my colleague, Elan Journo, who's a fellow and director of policy research at the Ayn Rand Institute. He's the author of Winning the Unwinnable War, America's Self-Crippled Response to Islamic Totalitarianism. It's a busy day for everybody in the nation's capital, so I want to move this along. I'm going to give each panelist the floor twice. First, for about 6 minutes each, to present their basic point of view on these issues, and then once again for a shorter time at their option for rebuttal and additional comments. After that, we're going to have, I think, a generous amount of time for questions from the audience. So let me first turn to Aaron Miller and ask him to get us started.
I'm going to speak from here.
Okay.
That's okay. Tom, thanks for everybody for coming. Over the last 25 years or so, I had the honor and privilege of providing advice to a half a dozen secretaries of state on Arab-Israeli negotiations. Some of the advice was good, much of it wasn't so good. When it was bad, it was always based on one fundamental point of departure. I was inclined to see the world the way I wanted it to be rather than the way it was. And in life, whether it's marriage, friendship, business, success really involves the balance between the way the world is on one hand and the way you want it to be on the other. If you only see the world the way it is, nothing ever changes. But I guarantee you, if you only see the world the way you want it to be, you will fail in whatever dimension of the human enterprise you want to apply your skills and talents to. I'm going to make three basic points. Why we don't have Israeli-Palestinian peace, what it would take to produce Israeli-Palestinian peace. And I want to conclude with a comment on U.S. interests. This is not deep philosophy, metaphysics, magic, or mythology. The reason there is no peace agreement or, let's say, agreement between Israelis and Palestinians is because we are missing the four essential characteristics of such a conclusion. You give me these four, I'll give you even and I'll choose my words carefully, a conflict-ending solution, even though I think one is not possible today. Number one, the absence of leaders. Let's be clear, when we've had any measure of success, it's because we've had Israelis and Arabs who are not prisoners of their constituencies, but masters of their political houses. This is not just true in the Arab-Israeli enterprise, it's true in almost any aspect of international relations. South Africa ended the way it did because of de Klerk and Mandela. There may be other contributing factors, but without those two, forget it. John Keegan argued that 6 men between the years 1920 and 1950 fundamentally were responsible for most of the death, destruction, devastation, and prospects of peace and prosperity for much of the Western world. 6 men. So there's an extraordinary causality here between transformative leaders. We do not have them in the Israeli-Palestinian dimension right now. And without them, you cannot even begin to expect the kinds of galactically difficult, heroic decisions that need to be made. Number two, the gaps on the 5 core issues that now separate the parties, border security, refugees, Jerusalem, and the recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, the gaps on these issues are wide and perhaps unbridgeable, perhaps, to produce such a, again, I'll use the term very precisely, conflict-ending solution. Number 3, the politics on each side are not great. The negotiations, the hopes, the expectations outrun the political realities. Israel's a deeply divided country. I don't care what the polls show with respect to the desire for peace, the importance of a 2-state solution. The politics today are running in an opposite direction. And on the Palestinian side, the situation is worse. You have a fundamentally divided Palestinian polity. I call it, it's beyond the Palestinian Humpty Dumpty, it's like Noah's Ark. There are essentially 2 of everything. 2 constitutions, 2 sets of security services, 2 sets of patrons, 2 different visions of what constitutes where the putative state of Palestine should be and what it should be. And finally, you do not have a mediator that has the interest or the capacity right now, assuming you need one, and you do need one. There's a mythology about the Arab-Israeli negotiations that direct negotiations produce agreements. They do not. There's only one example in the history of the entire so-called peace process in which a truly direct negotiation produced an agreement, and that was the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. In every other instance, and we only had 3 breakthroughs, Kissinger's disengagement agreements of the 70s, Carter's peace treaty at Camp David, and Bush and Baker's Madrid Peace Conference. All of these involved direct negotiations, but more important than that was American mediation. You do not have these things. If they appeared, when they appear, you'd have, I would argue, a reasonable chance of reaching an agreement. It is almost unimaginable to me, and I agree with one of our most preeminent philosophers, Groucho Marx, who argued, who are you going to believe, Groucho said. Actually, I think he was Harpo. He was dressed as Harpo. Harpo doesn't speak, but somebody uttered the following phrase. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? I see what I see. And it's almost unimaginable to me that an Israeli prime minister and a Palestinian president can stand before their respective legislative bodies and say the following. We do not have peace. It may take another generation. But on the 5 core issues that drive our conflict, all claims have been adjudicated. All irredenta have been abandoned. That is almost unimaginable. That does not mean something short of that might not be possible. But the conflict ending agreement, unlikely. Finally, let me conclude with just a brief comment on American interests. I would argue to you we have 4 or 5 core interests in this region and several other ones that are what I call discretionary, all right? And the core interests are driven by where we put our time, our attention, our money, and our priorities. The discretionary interests, obviously, since they're discretionary, they don't reflect the same kind of commitment. Interest number 1, the organizing principle of any nation's foreign policy. You protect the homeland. If you cannot protect the homeland, you do not need a foreign policy. And I would argue on this core interest, we are doing reasonably well. Second, weaning ourselves off of Arab hydrocarbons. We are doing actually a pretty remarkable job on that interest as well. I would check the box there. Now, energy security is another matter. We cannot be neglectful of the fact that 40% of the Earth's known petroleum reserves come from a specific part of the world. And if 6 oil tankers a day separate Japan from economic chaos and oil trades in one market, as it does, any disruption can wreak havoc in financial and economic markets. So energy security is still a problem. 3, protecting the security of the State of Israel. Enough said. The U.S.-Israel relationship, despite the ups and downs, is far more resilient today, far more deeply entrenched, both in American politics and policy, than ever before. And 4, extricating ourselves from the 2 longest wars and profitless wars in American history. The 2 discretionary interests are the pursuit of Arab-Israeli peace, which we have pursued episodically over the years, and finally, comporting ourselves to what used to be called the Arab Spring, which in my judgment was never a vital interest. And if I had more time, and perhaps I will, there's a nice transition there to the issue of what to do about Syria. Thank you very much.
Daniel Pipes.
Thank you. Aaron is, along with Dennis Ross, the American who has the greatest experience with the intricacies of Arab-Israeli diplomacy, and you've heard a summary of his long experience in that. I'm on the outside. I served only for 1 year in the State Department and generally outside. And I would start with 2 contextual comments. First is that when one said the Middle East conflict until a few years ago, one meant the Arab-Israeli conflict. Today one does not. Today one means Syria aflame, Egypt on the precipice, and much more. In other words, the Arab-Israeli conflict has lost its historic prominence. It is no longer what it used to be. Secondly, all parties have agreed, or both parties have agreed, that the Oslo Agreement, Oslo Accords of 20 years minus 2 days ago, 3 days ago, was a failure. There's no dispute. There's, of course, dispute about why it failed, but there's no dispute as to the fact of its failure. I would like to offer to you my explanation of why it failed. My explanation is, in part, obviously, Palestinian irredentism, but in part, Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel at that time, saying over and over again, one does not make peace with one's friends, one makes peace with one's enemy. The Israeli Prime Minister expected war to be concluded through goodwill, conciliation, mediation, flexibility, restraint, generosity, and compromise, topped off with signatures on official documents. He, and more broadly the Israeli public, did not see that Israeli concessions in fact inflamed Palestinian hostility. Palestinians in fact interpreted Israeli efforts to make peace, as was called, as signals of demoralization and of weakness. Painful concessions reduced, as the Israelis called it, reduced the Palestinian awe of Israel, made the Jewish state appear vulnerable, and incited the very same irredentist dreams of annihilation. Each Oslo negotiated gesture by Israel further exhilarated, radicalized, and mobilized the Palestinian body politic to make war. The quiet hope of 1993 to eliminate Israel gained traction, becoming a deafening roar by the year 2000 when the Oslo process came to an end. In other words, things were not great before 1993, but they became much worse after. For example, there were fewer deaths by terrorism of Israelis, fewer deaths of Israelis by terrorism in the 15 years prior to Oslo than there were in the 5 years hence. Rabin's mistake was simple and profound. One cannot, quote, make peace with one's enemy, as he imagined Israel could. Rather, one makes peace with one's former enemy. Peace nearly always requires one side in a conflict to be defeated and to give up on its goals. One doesn't make peace with an enemy, one makes peace with a former enemy, the enemy who has given up on his goals. And Rabin's mistake is symptomatic of a general Israeli and more broadly universal mistake to try and finesse the hard work of winning a war. This is a war. Wars end when one side wins. If you take, for example, World War I, no side clearly won, and therefore you had World War II. And in World War II, they realized the mistake of World War I, and they had total victory. And it was very clear that one side won and one side lost. The Israelis and Americans who've been involved in negotiations, in diplomacy, have been trying to find a way around defeat and victory. But there's no avoiding it. Wars end when one side gives up. It only makes sense, right? As long as the two sides are both interested and hopeful of gaining their goals, they will not end their conflict. Only when one side gives up does the conflict come to an end. Now, this has a very clear application today. John Kerry has made Arab-Israeli diplomacy a centerpiece. It strikes me as a bit crazy, and perhaps you too, with all that's going on in the world, never mind the Middle East, but he has done so. He traveled 6 times in his first 4 months as Secretary of State. He has put an outsized emphasis on this. And yet I would argue to you that there's no chance whatsoever of this succeeding because neither side is defeated. The Israelis have not said, you know, we tried Zionism, it failed, we're going to either accept Palestinian authority or move to the United States and Australia. The Palestinians have not said, you know, we accept a Jewish state in Israel and we're going to tend to our own garden and build our own society, polity, culture, and economy. No, neither of those have happened. So the war goes on. And I, in preparation for this, looked at the last month's worth of bulletins from Palestinian Media Watch, and they give a sense of the Palestinian enduring, PA, not Hamas, enduring Palestinian Authority hostility to Israel. Here's one. PA honors the killers of 238 Israelis during Ramadan. PA Radio, one day there will be no Israel. Fatah continues to glorify Saddam Hussein. Fatah, without blood, Palestine will not return. PA TV, all of Israel is Palestine. PA gives dignified life grant, so-called, to 5,000 released prisoners. Terrorists featured in Palestinian educational role model film. PA libel, Israel spreads drugs to harm Palestinians, and on and on and on. So long as this is the case, so long as the PA, not to speak of Hamas, still has this dream of eliminating Israel as the Jewish state, there's no chance whatsoever. And sooner or later, it will be necessary to give up on this model of diplomacy and substitute a model of winning. I think the solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict is not conciliation and mediation and compromise and concession. The solution is Israel winning, the Palestinians losing. Really simple. The Palestinians understand that. They're not interested in conciliation and mediation. They're interested in winning. Well, I think we and our side should be interested in winning, sending a very clear message to the Palestinians, you've lost. You cannot dream anymore of eliminating Israel. This is out of bounds. And so long as you do, you get no benefits from us. Now, that's certainly not the case of the current administration, but I'm hopeful that one of these days there will be an administration that will bring this new attitude, not one of conciliation, mediation, compromise, and diplomacy, but one of winning, our side winning, the opposite side, the side that's hostile to us and hostile to our ally, losing. Really simple. We win, they lose.
Thank you, Daniel. Jonathan Tobin.
Thank you. I guess I'd start now after Aaron and Daniel have pretty much said a great deal. Aaron has explained to us what happened in the last 20 years. Daniel has explained why it was a disaster. For a moment, I'd like to just think back to 20 years. And since, as Daniel, I think, rightly said, Oslo was a disaster, I know I hear from readers all the time asking, well, how could this have been averted? Could it have been averted? If you think it was a disaster, how do you think it could have been stopped? And the more I think about it, it's clear that this was a disaster that could not have been stopped. Now, mind you, a long time ago when I was a student in the history department at Columbia University, one of my professors said something to me that I've never forgotten, in that he told me that everything in history is evitable. We are, and as Aaron said, history is the product of the actions of individuals and nations, and the choices that they make impact what follows. And yet, as much as we look back on the illusions and the myths that led the West, the United States, and more particularly Israel, to embrace the Oslo Accords, it's clear to me, or at least I think it's clear, that it could not have been stopped. We can go back to counterfactuals. Had the 1992 Israeli election happened slightly differently, a few votes here or there, Shamir might have won that election, or it would have been a stalemate. But that really doesn't make any difference, because sooner or later the left in Israel was going to win an election, and sooner or later their idea of trying to make peace in this way, of embracing Arafat and bringing him back from exile and creating a peace partner for them, or at least what they felt would be a peace partner. Sooner or later, that was going to be tried. And then it was inevitably going to fail. And it failed, as others have already said, because of our illusions about what was happening, because throughout the 1990s, as the Oslo process first was signed and then unfolded, both Israel and the United States, it wasn't just the United States or the Clinton administration, consciously turned their eyes away from what was going on in the territories, what the Palestinian Authority that they had created, what they had wrought. And it was an entity that was as dedicated to conflict and perpetuation of the conflict, albeit on far more advantageous terms than they had before Oslo, and that was going to, and it just had to. The point is, the logic, or the seeming logic of, well, you have to try, sooner or later was going to be tried. And therefore, the euphoria that met the Oslo agreements, and let me disagree with 2 points we've already heard about Israel being divided. Aaron's right, Israel is divided. Israel's always divided. It's got a million different parties. But the point is, and that was true in 1993, it's true today. If an Israeli leader is ever confronted with a Palestinian partner who's willing to make peace, they'll have to take the deal. Doesn't matter what the right-wing parties say. The majority of the Israeli people are willing to make drastic sacrifices for peace, even disadvantageous ones, even abandoning their rights in many respects. They will try it. The question, though, is, what have we learned in the last 20 years? And it seems to me that while the Israeli public, which is far more cynical about the Palestinians than they once were, has learned many of those lessons, and indeed the collapse of the left-wing parties that created the Oslo process should tell us something about people waking up, looking at the facts, trying something, it didn't work, and then drawing the proper conclusions, that we in the United States, both among the supporters of Israel and the United States government, still cling to many of these same illusions about the Palestinians, still refuse to look at the nature of and the culture of Palestinian politics, a culture that still rewards and lauds terrorism, that still sees it as a zero-sum game. After all, Palestinian nationalism was created as a reaction to Zionism, not intrinsically just about creating a Palestinian Arab state, but about getting rid of the Jewish state. That's still majority opinion. We can look at different Palestinian polls, but it's still there. Now, how do we get past this? Now, the problem is not just that this was inevitable, it failed, and now it's going to go now we're just going to go. What we have to do now is to manage the conflict. The two clear parts that put forward the Oslo process was this idea that solving this problem was central to all of the Middle East, and also that the Palestinians were willing to make peace. We've now learned both of those things are not true. And yet, the United States government persists in putting forward policies that are based on the same mistaken ideas. They also don't take seriously what goes on in the Palestinian Authority. And that's not just the culture of violence in the Palestinian media. It's the way the Arab world treated the Palestinians for generations, keeping them homeless, refusing to help them. The Palestinian Authority does the same thing. 20 years of empowerment has led to corrupt crony politics in which the billions of aid have been wasted and nothing isn't. If the Palestinians think that they've got nothing out of Oslo, it's because they haven't, and it's because they've been cheated by their own leaders. This is not just, though, the lack of a good leader, it's the lack of a culture that can produce a good leader. And until that sea change occurs, all of this is ultimately futile. Until we lower our expectations and begin to merely try to manage the conflict rather than try to solve it in some new expression. I mean, I would say certainly John Kerry is showing leadership in doggedly pushing forward the peace process this year, but he's doing it in a way that shows that he has no conception. He has, as Aaron said, just seeing the world the way he wants to and not the way it actually is, since there is no chance that a Palestinian Authority threatened by Hamas, with its own core constituency refusing still to make peace, to recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state no matter where its borders are drawn. As long as we predicate our policies on that, we are bound to replicate the failures of the last 20 years. And as long as America is invested in that, we will be investing in failure.
Thank you, Jonathan. Elan Journo.
So I want to add a perspective on some of the comments we've heard already, with which I agree in part. I think that there's a missing aspect in trying to understand what happened with the Oslo process and why it fell apart. And I would put it this way. Let me give you a hypothetical scenario to dramatize it. If I told you Al Capone, the notorious gangster, or pick someone even worse, Al Capone overnight is going to become Mr. Rogers. You know who Mr. Rogers is? He puts on that sweater, reads stories to children. You would laugh me out of the room. You would say they're in radically different moral categories. This is a man who pioneered international terrorism on the one hand, and this is a man who reads stories to children and is the most lovable figure on PBS for children's TV at the time. Well, that's exactly, in my view, what we've seen as the predication for the peace process. It's what I characterize as a morally gray approach. It's not ignoring moral differences. It's smudging them. It's pretending that they're blurry when they're not. I think you can draw sharp moral divides between the two sides. And part of what led to the downfall of the process is that it was predicated on the fact that that's not too important to do. And as a consequence of that, how does this really play out? Well, my dramatization was not that far from reality. Arafat really had to do very little to demonstrate his abandonment of terrorism and his acceptance of Israel in pro forma, not in substance. We saw that, his continuing sponsorship and engineering of terrorist attacks. That didn't really go away. And yet there was a pretense that, well, just one more concession will lead us to a better solution. And so it became, so that's sort of the theory, that you drop out the moral judgment from this kind of policy making. And in practice, what that means is you ignore the basic character and goals of the two sides. The PLO-Arafat axis and what became the PA, I think it's fair to say their goal is not a free society. We've seen that demonstrated when they got a little bit of power under the PA. We saw that prior when they were trying to wreak havoc in the Middle East, in Jordan and Lebanon. This is a movement or a cause seeking political tyranny, subjugation of people, in sharp contrast with the Israeli project, which is, it's many things, but fundamentally you can say it's a regime that protects individual rights. It protects freedom. It's demonstrable. It stands out. It's distinguished for that factor. And when you drop out that difference and you treat them as equals at the negotiating table, ignoring, as Mr. Pipes put it, the fact that if you're in a conflict, there has to be a resolution, either win or lose, that gets blurred too. The practice is that you encourage the more militant because that's what's rewarded, because the trade is not really a trade between equals anymore. It's not a win-win. It's a win-lose relationship. And I think the fairer term for that is not trade, but you could call it extortion, and hence the parallel with Al Capone and gangsters and how you treat them. And I think the idea of enabling the Palestinian dream to stay alive, I think, as you put it earlier, there is no incentive to drop that ideal if what you're constantly seeing are yet more negotiations, each time ratcheted up to the last minimum offer over time. So I think the first point I wanted to stress is that in understanding the failure, I think one has to recognize the basic moral underpinnings, and that it was doomed because the framework assumes you can ignore basic moral differences between parties. And I would add one final point now to orient us toward what's happening now in the Middle East and what we might do in the future. I agree with the observation that the Arab-Israeli conflict is no longer central, and it shouldn't be seen as central. I think that's been true for a long time. Recent events have brought that to the surface for those who have been doubting it or have been buying into the false narrative. But I think it's interesting to turn to the Syria issue, because one of the issues here is we're going to lose credibility if we don't act. Now, there's lots to say here, but I think it's interesting to connect this with the peace process too. There's a kind of Rip Van Winkle moment here. If we're really worried about American credibility, well, what would one observe from the American-led peace process? It's been a disaster. What would one observe for 30 years of America's confrontation with Iran, where Iran is attacking Americans and killing Americans directly and through proxy, and we've done nothing? 10 years plus of Iran's nuclear program. These add up, and you have to see this in a context, not in a vacuum. And I think part of the problem we face is that because we don't have a clear view of how to bring moral ideas into policymaking, that cripples us in defining our priorities. So if you ask me about Syria, I'd say it's not a priority. The priority would be Iran, and it has been for a long time. And I think the same is true of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Itself, in many phases, has been a conflict among other parties, pushing the actors like pawns on a chessboard in many cases. So I would say, understanding what happened in the past and drawing lessons, it's crucial to see and to make sharp moral judgments about the actors, and to bring that to today, bringing in our own view. Well, what should be shaping our approach? Well, I think it's this principle that our policy has one interest. That's the way to define it. It's the protection of the individual rights of Americans, the freedom of Americans. And that sets one red line that should never be crossed universally. And it's a clear one that we can use in judging what to do and how to approach different conflicts. There's more to say about that, but that kind of sets a different context and a different framework. And you can bring it back to the Arab-Israeli conflict and other situations that we're facing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Elan. That's the end of round one. Round two will proceed in the same order with the same individuals for a much shorter time. I'm going to suggest 2 or 3 minutes for any rebuttal, commentary, additional thoughts before we go to the audience.
Terrific. I just have 3 or 4 observations. Number one, Oslo is a set of agreements failed, but it has left a very consequential legacy that continues to, let me use the term facts on the ground, continues to basically create the parameters within which the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation has been resolved. Oslo created the Palestinian Authority, which is now a reality and is likely to remain a reality for some time to come, despite its corruption, dysfunction, and propagation of continuing values of grievance and conflict. Number two, Oslo enabled the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty to be signed. There would have been no agreement between King Hussein and Yitzhak Rabin had not Arafat made his own deal with the Israelis, however imperfect a deal that was. It freed King Hussein from the constraints Jordan never could have been, and no one ever imagined Jordan would have been the second Arab head of state to sign a full treaty of peace with Israel. Number three, Oslo created, and it remains to this day, however dysfunctional, an effort to reconcile Zionism, political Zionism, with the organizational embodiment of Palestinian nationalism. Now, that organizational embodiment, the PLO, is now riven with contradictions and anomalies because it exists now in two competitive forms and streams which are at odds with one another. So Oslo may have failed in its capacity to deliver, but do not make the mistake of believing that what it left in its wake was an extraordinarily determinative of the reality today. Number two, history of peacemaking on the Israeli side is not a history of the left. Let's disabuse ourselves of that notion. It is a history of transformed hawks. Transformed hawks. Hard men who cut deals in response to exigency and their own efforts to further their interests. Begin traded Sinai to keep the ultimate prize, the West Bank and Jerusalem. Rabin, the breaker of bones in the First Intifada, was not, as Daniel described him, a man who believed deeply in conciliation and concession. Rabin did Oslo for one reason, and you know the story. It's not a story, it's true. That in August of 1993, he told Christopher that he was prepared to withdraw fully from the Golan Heights, full withdrawal from the Golan Heights. Christopher went to Damascus to sell that deal to Assad. Assad was Rabin's primary interlocutor of the two. Assad came back with a no to full withdrawal. Had to be June 4, 67 borders, and Rabin would not agree to that. And as a consequence, Peres and the Oslo negotiators pursued the second track. It was not Rabin's first preference. Never. And the left today in Israel has hijacked Rabin's memory. They have corrupted and distorted his views. He never would have signed up for what has been attributed to Rabin today. Finally, one last point. And let's be clear. And Tom, I'll forgive you because you're not a Middle East expert for talking about the American-led Oslo process. Let's be clear about something. The three great breakthroughs in the history of the Arab-Israeli peace process, the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, and the collapsed Oslo process, were all done in secret without the knowledge of the United States. Without the knowledge of the United States. When Dayan showed up in this city in October of 1977 to brief my former colleagues on his secret meetings with Sadat's vice president, Tahami, people were stunned. The Israelis and Jordanians had been meeting for years discreetly. And I was called back from vacation in Florida in August of 1993 by the State Department Operations Center and informed that Christopher was heading to California to meet with the Norwegian Foreign Minister Holtz and Shimon Peres, because the two sides had agreed on the Declaration of Principles and wanted to sign it in Washington. This notion, which is dangerous, and as an American, I will defend it and reject it, that it is we who have been incessantly, relentlessly, willfully consumed and obsessed with the Arab-Israeli peace process is just not the case. I described it myself as a discretionary interest. Various administrations have pursued it episodically, half-heartedly, some with real conviction. This is an Israeli-Palestinian issue, and that's precisely, in my judgment, where it belongs.
Thank you, Aaron. Daniel.
I'll ignore the Rabin comment. I think it's on the record that he said what he said. But I will take Aaron on the last point about the U.S. involvement. Yes, historically, the Israelis have been driving this process. Israelis have been the one pushing. There have been many examples. Another one he did not mention was that in January 2003, Ariel Sharon defeated his labor opponent by saying he would never leave Gaza. And then in November, he surprised the Bush administration, November 2003, by saying, I'm going to leave Gaza. Americans had nothing to do with it. True for the past, not true for the present. It is not the Israeli government that is seeking to have new rounds of diplomacy. It is the U.S. government. And let me explain why. There is a widespread notion, especially in the Democratic Party, that of the many, many problems of the Middle East, the one way to get a better handle is by resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. If you can fix this, then economic crisis in Egypt, civil war in Syria, nuclear buildup in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, you mentioned it, Libya, Tunisia, all these many problems are one notch less difficult because you don't have your Arab interlocutors and Iranian, Turkish interlocutors berating you about the Arab-Israeli conflict. If you can only take that off the table, then you're more effective in everything else. And this has led, in particular, the Obama administration to have this focus on Israel that is epitomized by the Kerry effort that's now taking place. So this is American-led. I agree, not in the past. But there are no surprises now. There are no secret negotiations now between Israelis and Palestinians. This is American-driven, and it is a foolhardy enterprise.
Jonathan.
I'd like to take. We'll separate them for these two for a minute, but let me take issue with a couple of things that they've both said. Although I certainly think there's much truth in actually what both of them have said as well. The thing about Oslo, and where I differ somewhat with Daniel, is the idea that it can somehow be reversed by someday an American administration waking up or the world waking up and understanding that it's a zero-sum game and Israel has to win and the Palestinians have to lose. The thing, whatever you may say about Oslo, and I've said many mean things about that process, it really is now a permanent part of the international system. It cannot be reversed. It is ingrained not only in terms of the United States policy, the United Nations, Europe. It's there. It's not going away, nor is the Palestinian Authority going away, as bad as it is, as counterproductive as it is. And that is, that's Israel. That's a dilemma for both Israel and the United States, in that it can't be wished away. It is now there, that as Zionists used to talk about facts on the ground, the Palestinians have their facts on the ground. They have a government of sorts in Ramallah that has some sort of control over much of the West Bank, and they have an independent state in all but name in Gaza being run by an Islamist movement, which is still clearly at war not only with Israel but with Fatah, despite their occasional feints at making a unity agreement. This is there. It cannot be undone. And when we speak of managing the conflict, that is the reality that any Israeli leader, whether he is broad-minded, willing to pursue peace or not, is going to have to deal with. Now, in terms of the great Rabin controversy we're having here, in essence, you're both right. Because the fact is, I think Rabin was, I had the privilege, just a couple of weeks before he died, I got to interview him at the Waldorf when he was on, I think, his last trip to the United States. And he inveighed in that interview, I will, if the Palestinians do this, the whole thing is over. You know, he talked a very good game about never would he let if they turn to terrorism. The whole thing is off. And he repeated, as he often did, his formulation that by turning the West Bank and Gaza over to Arafat, that he was going to be able to defeat terrorism without the hindrances that Rabin himself had when he was Minister of Defense during the first Intifada, as he said, you know, without B'Tselem and without a Supreme Court, you know, hindering him. That, as it turns out, we'll never know whether Rabin would have kept his word, just as we'll never know whether what Ariel Sharon said before the Gaza withdrawal, that if it turns out to be a base for terrorism and, you know, as much as a disaster as it's turned out to be, that the whole thing is off, that it's reversible. The problem with these concessions is that they're not reversible. Once you make them, the rules for Israel is that you can't go back because the rest of the world, the United States, its only ally, won't let them. That's why it's so dangerous, and that's why Israeli leaders have to play it close to the vest and be careful, because once you give stuff away, it never comes back. And that's one of the key, along with the illusions, along with the turning the blind eye to the Palestinian Authorities' misbehavior and corruption. That's the thing. These are not things that, these are not reasonable. You can't go to court and say, look, they violated the agreement, it's all off. It's not all off. The Palestinians have pocketed what they've gotten from Oslo. And I'll just, one more quick point. Defenders of the Oslo Agreement had, and as Aaron rightly says, it's a whole series of agreements. Netanyahu is complicit in many of them as well. The defense of it in part is that it's lessened Israel's isolation in the world. Aaron mentions the 1994 peace treaty with Jordan. I think these benefits are not only overdrawn because it's not clear that Israel's strategic position vis-a-vis Jordan is that much better with a peace treaty than without a peace treaty, because it had a cold peace before and it has kind of a cold peace now. Similarly, I think Daniel alluded to it, Israel's legitimacy is now more in question today than it was 20 years ago. Instead of getting credit for giving up the land and taking risks for peace, it has been seen by the international community as a thief disgorging their illegal booty, their things that they had no right to. And therefore, its ability to keep negotiating in the negotiations going on now and whatever will happen in the future has been undermined by this delegitimization of the idea that this is a dispute between two parties with rights, not merely, and the Israelis are complicit in this as well. I'll just conclude by saying that is when Israeli governments only speak of security and not rights, they are bound to lose, because in the court of international opinion, those who claim to rights always will win over those who just claim security.
Thank you, Jonathan. Elan.
2 quick points. You characterized some of the impetus for the Oslo project as, well, let's test this out. It has to be tested. And I think the bookend to that was the Gaza retreat, which was, if there was a need to test what's going to happen, what is it going to look like when you withdraw, I think the Gaza withdrawal demonstrates beyond any question if you needed that kind of demonstration. And I guess that pushes to the issue, is it really necessary to regard seriously this idea that Kerry is going to go to the Middle East and make this a real focus? I mean, there's no third or eighth piece of paper that we're missing here. This is a fundamental problem, is mischaracterizing what needs to happen here. And here I agree wholeheartedly with your characterization of the issue. There needs to be a conclusive resolution, which is binary. It's either defeat or victory. And I know the PA and Oslo have created institutions that are part of the fabric of the world, but those things can be removed, and they should be. I mean, they're a blight. They're harming the interests of Israel, and they're harming the U.S. security position. It's radical, and it pushes against a lot of entrenched views and beliefs, but there is no hope, I think, unless that's on the table. And the second quick point I would make, which is I find it interesting that looking at Israel and the issue of legitimization, it's curious that that's even a question anymore. It is, but it's curious because the worst things that you could attribute to Israel, and even if they were true, and I don't think they are, just look at the Middle East today. 1 day's worth of atrocities in Syria should completely wash that out. In fact, the worst conceivable crimes that Israel is alleged to have done, which I don't think are true, pale in comparison with what is actually being done, demonstrably being done by the neighboring tyrants. And that should remind people that you can't have a double standard. You can't hold Israel to standards that nobody else is held to. In fact, it's unfair to regard it as somehow, well, your legitimacy is in question. Really? So Assad's legitimacy that's sacrosanct. We can't really question that, given his actions. I mean, that whole idea, there's a question, the legitimacy of a regime. But that shouldn't be what we're asking. I mean, look at Israel today and how it conducts itself, how people live there and what kind of freedoms they have. That should be the starting point. And it should be the regimes neighboring it that should be held to a higher standard, not a lower one.
Thank you. That's the end of round two. I swore I was not going to do this, but I have to ask one question since I've seen a theme that's of interest to me coming out of this. I don't know. Aaron started with a very strong emphasis on I think the mid-20th century when there was these 6 strong political leaders who basically had control of most of the world's population in terms of their political power. And yet we've heard in one form or another from the other panelists on the need for a binary win-lose outcome to the Middle East crisis. And I guess my question is for Aaron, are these two compatible in the sense that is there such a thing as a strong leader who can stand up and say, we're defeated, we've lost, let's move on? Or is it in the nature of these strong leaders that you're talking about that it's always we win, we fight another day, we never give up? Is it incompatible with a binary win-loss?
You know, if you looked at the 196 nations that currently sit in the UN, I would defy anybody to identify one, what I would call truly historic or transformative leader. This is a generational problem. But the question you ask is critically important because I'm stunned, actually, by the notion sitting here and watching this region over the last decade that anyone, particularly someone as brilliant as this man, could demand solutions rather than outcomes, could talk in terms of black and white when, in fact, what we're dealing with a region that is angry, broken, dysfunctional. It offers no clarity. It offers no certainty. It offers outcomes, a variety of different outcomes. We are emerging now from the 2 longest and among the most profitless wars in American history, where the standard for victory was never could we win, but when could we leave? Extrication becomes the metric for judging the performance of the most powerful nation on earth, and with hundreds of thousands of American forces, trillions of dollars expended, and what remains of our credibility, we are looking for certainty and outcomes. We're going to remove the Palestinian Authority because it constitutes a blight. We can barely address the anomalies and contradictions of our own broken house here. And yet you demand and require a commitment to principles. It is in the nature of great powers to be hypocritical and contradictory. We intervene in Libya, not in Syria. We support an Arab Spring in Egypt, but not in Saudi Arabia. We talk to the Taliban and the insurgents in Iraq who have committed terrible crimes against American soldiers. I'm not arguing that we engage with Hamas.
Well, since it's my question, let me just focus it.
Really difficult.
Is it possible for one of these
search for clarity?
Is it possible for one of these great leaders to admit defeat for his country? Has that happened? Did any of your 6 do that and say we've lost?
Several of my 6 were defeated.
But did they?
I mean, one committed suicide, another died of disease, and a third was
Who are the 6?
Well, come on, this is elemental. I mean, I'm not going to identify them for you. You know who they are.
I don't.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's see, you got Winston Churchill, you got Franklin Roosevelt, you got Mao Zedong, you have Adolf Hitler, you have Joseph Stalin, and who would you count as a sixth? I'm not sure he would be consequential enough. But you can shoot, let's assume the sixth is discretionary, all right? You can identify your six. My point, though, is that willful, transformative leaders can do ill and good, and they are nowhere to be seen in today's political culture. So the kinds of outcomes that are being hoped for here simply aren't possible.
I think the other three panelists may have nominated Daniel for a brief response, and then we're on to audience questions.
Thank you for the kind praise, Aaron. But I don't think you quite understood what I was saying. I wasn't saying that we should go in and extirpate the Palestinian Authority. I'm saying that we should tell our ally that it should win, rather than we telling it, as we are presently, that it should make more painful concessions. I'm talking about a different approach, one where our ally wins like we want to win in our various wars. We want our ally to win. That's all.
Daniel, you live in Philadelphia, but you're close enough to Washington to know that in terms of American policy, that hopefulness, that sense of expectation, that wistfulness, that's never going to change.
But one of the benefits of not living in Washington, is that one can imagine things that those of you who live in Washington can't imagine.
Oh, I can imagine it. It's just I don't think it's going to occur.
Jonathan, one comment, then let's go to.
Well, I as much as I probably agree more with Daniel in terms of the overall issue, I think it's not just that the politics of Washington make it impossible to get rid of the Palestinian Authority. It's the politics of Jerusalem as well. As much as most Israelis say, just forget Oslo, just talk about the Gaza withdrawal. Most Israelis understand that the Gaza withdrawal was really a bad idea. Didn't work out the way they wanted. But I don't think. But I've seen polls, and I've spoken to. There's very little interest in going back into Gaza. Hamastan is a permanent. It's a permanent addition. Israel isn't getting it back. Israel doesn't even want it back. So.
I didn't say Israel should go into Gaza. I'm talking about the defeat of a people. I didn't say occupation of Gaza. There is this sense among Palestinians that they are onto a good thing and they can win. I would like Israel, with our support and other support, to send a signal to the Palestinians, no, you cannot win. You have lost, in the sense that Israel's here and it's permanent. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about reoccupying Gaza.
Well, if you were to frame that, I mean, when you speak of winning and losing, we see the issue in more apocalyptic terms, and I think that's what Aaron is reacting to. You know, if that means that the United States tells the Palestinian Authority that they don't get to dictate terms, and that the best that the most generous Israeli offer on the table is the best that they can get, and they either take it or leave it, that makes sense. And I'm not sure that at times that hasn't even been communicated to the Palestinian Authority. They just don't. They just think they have impunity, and they don't believe us.
Let's go to the audience. We have, by my clock, 33 minutes for questions. Questions, please, not commentary. I will enforce that by various means. And there is a procedure here. I'll call on you. We have a gentleman in the blue shirt with a microphone. Please wait for the microphone. Speak into the microphone so that the video recording can pick it up. And when you're called upon, please give a name and affiliation if you have one. And if you want to indicate a particular panelist to address your question to, that's fine also. So this side of the room definitely was most eager, so I'm just going to go randomly, this gentleman here on the end.
Hi, my name is Kyle Shadler. I'm with the Endowment for Middle East Truth. And my question is to Aaron David Miller about this idea of transformative leaders. You said there's no transformative leader in any of the nations of the UN, and I would ask, look at a man like Youssef al-Qaradawi, who doesn't control any country, but is possibly one of the most influential people in the Middle East right now. And the Middle East has been fundamentally transformed through the power of these Islamist movements. And my question is, why are we necessarily centering this idea of transformation and leadership within states rather than within political movements or within religious movements, which seems to be right now where the Middle East is headed?
And we should broaden the discussion, I think, when we talk about leaders in terms of globalization, social media, the capacity to influence. I think it's a very good point. I question the whole premise about Islamic fundamentalism, making some sort of comeback. I mean, we've seen what's happened in Egypt. The problem in the Middle East is that nobody's going to win. That's the reality, and it again confirms my point that what you're dealing with is not only decentralization of states, Iraq, Syria. Lebanon has been a non-state for years. The putative state of Palestine is fundamentally divided. You're talking about the absence of functional governance. The 22 democracies in the world since 1950 have maintained their democratic character continuously. 22, minus India and Turkey, who suspended emergency democratic process at various points during their history. This is not an easy club to get into. And like other things in life, good marriages, good music, fine wine, time is the ultimate arbiter of what determines value in this world. And the three things that define democratic life right now in this broken, angry, dysfunctional region do not exist. No, the problem is not Yusuf Qaradawi's. The problem is that you don't have the kinds of leaders who are prepared to rise above their narrow, partisan, sectarian, religious, and corporatist affiliations to talk about a national vision. Nowhere in this region, not even in Turkey. That infatuation with Erdogan is over. Do we have this?
Do others have a comment on that particular question? Okay, hearing none. This gentleman here in the white.
Hi, my name is Zach Shireman from the American-Israeli Cooperative Enterprise. My question is for anyone on the panel who wants to answer it. This panel has been about U.S. policy towards Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. My question is, does there actually need to be a policy? It seems to me, not that I have a lot of experience, but both sides are very happy the way things are. The Palestinians are happy fighting a war against Israel they can never win. Israel's happy keeping the Palestinians contained. So if they like things the way they are, why can't America just leave them to it?
There need to be an American policy, and what really is a policy? Anybody want to grab that one?
I'll just say this: the United States has, has an ally in the Middle East, a democratic ally in Israel. The United States has, I think, a vested interest in terms of its values, in terms of its influence abroad, in helping to maintain Israel's independence. And that is not, as much as strong a country as Israel is, it is dependent, as much as many Israelis chafe at it, and especially on the right lately, we hear a lot about that. Israel still needs the United States. So the United States has to be engaged there. The United States also, like it or not, has friends in the Arab world. And therefore, it has to, we can't just say it doesn't have to have a policy. It needs to avoid stupid policies. It needs to have genuine leaders. We've been talking about who are the transformative leaders. I think in the last couple of weeks, we have been seeing the opposite of transformative leadership or even able leadership in this country. And leave aside all the political grudges. Some can. I write and edit for a conservative publication. What we've had here in the last couple of weeks is the collapse of American leadership, and that is always a dangerous thing. Whatever you think about intervention in Syria or the implications for Iran, when there are no leaders, and when there is a complete absence of a coherent policy, the United States loses and its allies lose.
Okay, next question would be this gentleman over here, far side of the room.
It seems that always the strongest part of our government that is for making peace between Israel and Palestinians is the State Department. And I was pleased that Daniel only spent 1 year there, and I know Aaron has spent many more years. I only spent 7 years there. But what I did find out was that there's a culture of the department that anything can be solved by negotiation. And there may be something in the water there that strengthens this belief. Why is it that we have not had a strong president that has taken a lead, except for Carter, perhaps, and it's usually the State Department, and now it is doing so with Kerry, that is trying to make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, when going back to William Rogers in 1969 with his peace plan, no one has been able to do it. I'm sort of confused as to what is wrong with the culture of the State Department that they keep hitting their head against this wall.
You have a tremendous experience. I spent 25 years at the Department of State, and I would say a couple of things. Where you stand in life has a lot to do with where you sit. And you're quite right. Americans, not just at the State Department, we are the fix-it people. We're the only great power in the history of the world that has non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and fish, literally fish, to our east and west, what one historian called our liquid assets. These two oceans and these non-predatory neighbors make us see the world in very idealized, unrealistic terms. We forgot what it's like to live on the knife's edge. We forgot what it's like. The margin available to the small power is not a large margin. So we have diplomats. I mean, I spend many years doing precisely what you're suggesting. But I just want to remind everyone of Maury's first point, that with the exception of Jimmy Carter, and it is true as today as it was then, because you talk about John Kerry all you want, a very smart man who wants to get into the Secretaries of State Hall of Fame. He needs to own a consequential issue. The Israeli-Palestinian issue is the one he wants to own. It is by no means certain that the guy who counts in our system fundamentally believes in this exercise, nor will be willing to court the profoundly painful choices that need to be made by an American president to mediate at Camp David III, notionally, a conflict-ending solution or any agreement at all. So I mean, the notion that, Daniel trumpets that somehow John Kerry has now staked everything on a set of negotiations which have a very low probability of succeeding along the lines I described. It's something that secretaries of state who want to be consequential, if they're allowed to do it, Hillary Clinton was not allowed to do it because Barack Obama is the most controlling foreign policy president since Richard Nixon. He dominates, and he does not delegate. If there's any doubt about that, look at the decision-making in reference to his decision to take Syria to the U.S. Congress. It wasn't Hagel and Kerry he consulted with. It was Dennis McDonough, and then his political advisors. So, sorry.
Other panelists have a response on that?
Long enough.
Daniel.
The State Department is excellent, superb at negotiating fishing treaties with Canada. That's why the State Department exists. It's full of lawyers who have mastered the technicalities. And to mix my metaphors, it's like businessmen going to meet the mafia. They don't know how to deal with tyrants. Never have. Been failing at it for a full century now. Sorry.
It goes back even longer
But
than I do.
Even longer than you were there. Yeah. But the reason why the State Department controls this to the extent it does, which it does, is because it's such a technical issue. It's so difficult. There's so many things to master. And you've got some slew of politicos who enter the White House and they don't know what's going on, so they leave it to the State Department. Let me also, by way of transformational figures, offer you my 4 transformational figures of the modern Middle East. They are Ataturk, Ben Gurion, Khomeini, and Nasser.
Right, and when did the last one die?
Agreed. Nasser, 70. Khomeini, 89.
Other questions? There's a lady in the back.
Okay. Thank you. Sarah Stern from the Endowment for Middle East Truth. I'm wondering, looking at the implosion of the Muslim and Arab world over the last year or two, and the events of Syria right now, do you think, finally, looking at the events in the real world of the Middle East, that there will be enough intellectual honesty and integrity for there to be a paradigm shift within the State Department, for them to realize how minor the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian peace actually is?
A paradigm shift. Anybody, and what would it take? Anybody want to address that one, or have we been addressing that?
I would just give one answer, no, but dare to be contradicted.
This gentleman here.
Bob Rosen. I love Israel, and that's why I'm here. I'm wondering, will America be able to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon? If not, when should Israel try to do that? Can they, and how should they do it?
What about Iran? Elan, you have some strong views on that. Is that a question you want to address? Or?
Say a couple of brief things. Is it feasible to stop them? Yeah, I would think so. I've heard people with expertise in the military side of it come up with different scenarios where they think there's a very high risk of doing it, but it could be done. I think the real obstacle is not military. It's whether there's the will to do it and the confidence that it's the right thing to do. I mean, everything I've seen in the last few years is that our non-policy is to run down the clock and just allow Iran to become a nuclear power and then treat it as a fait accompli and then manage it the way we manage other regimes that have nuclear weapons, in defiance of the fact that Iran is not like other regimes. It's very different. It's an ideologically driven regime, and that counts for a lot, but that gets derogated as an irrelevant factor. It's just, well, we succeeded with the communists. Why can't we do it with Iran? That's one argument you hear. And I think that ignores the fact that communism is a very different ideology. It's not suicidal in the way that we've seen some of the Iranian regime demonstrate itself to be. So I think that's really the core. Can it be done? Yes, it can be done. Will it be done? I think that's an open question, and I have doubts.
Okay, I just, my colleague Jeffrey Goldberg, who is one of our leading, really writers on the issues of the Middle East, continues to insist that in spite of the rather pathetic show this last month or two on Syria, that the United States, and in particular President Obama, is committed, that he means what he says. And whatever you may think about President Obama, his rhetoric on Iran has been crystal clear and has even escalated over the last 5 years. He believes that the United States will, when push comes to shove, do the right thing and prevent Iran from going nuclear one way or the other. I'm not excluding that as a possibility because, as I said before, history is inevitable. And, I have given up trying to predict what this president is going to do on foreign policy. And it may well be that he really does mean what he says about Iran, that this is a key U.S. security interest, and that he will keep his word. I find it hard to believe that this country will, or this administration will actually ever take a step. I think they are looking for any escape, any diplomatic fig leaf to avoid him having to make good on his promises. And as for Israel doing it by itself, I speak to different people in Israel. If you speak to people in the Kiryat and the Defense Ministry, some of them will, be very, will tell you, will puff their chests and say, we can do it. Others are far less sanguine, and frankly, I think I trust the instincts of those who are less sanguine. I don't think at this stage, with so much of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure going into hardened targets, and just the sheer breadth of the military problem that it would pose, I don't know that Israel can do it, and I know that Israel doesn't want to do it. So I think we're heading for a much more dangerous world, with it rather unlikely that the worst will be averted by any decisive U.S. action.
Anyone else on Iran? This gentleman here in the front in the red tie. Wait for the microphone. Yeah.
That Alan Baker, one of the drafters of the Levy report, just handed Catherine Ashton a list of 1,046 lawyers that believe that Israel already has sovereignty over all of the West Bank, all of Palestine, west of the Jordan River. If the Knesset were to approve the Levy report and Israel were to go forward and annex Judea and Samaria, why wouldn't this be a decent solution? If they said they were sovereign over the area, then wouldn't the UN Charter prohibit other nations from rushing in to prevent Israel administering a crushing defeat?
Is there a sovereignty solution? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I don't see anybody else eager to dive in. I'll just say this. Number one, the Knesset isn't going to approve that. There isn't a majority in the Knesset. As much as I think the Levy, speaking as someone who grew up on the Zionist right, I think the legal arguments for Israel's rights in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank are very powerful. That said, there isn't a clear majority, even in this current Knesset, for anything like that. The rest of the world would not respect the idea of Israeli sovereignty over it. It is a non-starter. It's just not going to happen, and it would set off a series of events that Israel doesn't want to deal with. And let's deal with the world. Aaron said, let's deal with the world as it is. The post-Oslo world makes that impossible. Let's deal with that.
We have a gentleman over here on the far right.
Victor Comras, attorney in private practice. First of all, I want to start off by saying I was in the State Department for 35 years. And in their defense, I have to say that when it came to the Israeli-Palestinian issues, we always chose the best, mostly from the outside, to come in and deal with this. People like Dennis Ross and Aaron Miller. And I don't think we could find better minds in the United States than those who were charged with trying to resolve this very difficult issue. I didn't involve myself ever in the Middle East exactly. I ran our sanctions program, but I do have one view that I'd like to get an answer to, and that is one dimension which we seem to have left out of this fairly pessimistic assessment of where we are today is the generational change. Where are we going now with a new generation, a generation that has been brought up where there's social media and mobilization, when people know what's going on in the rest of the world, where there is a greater interest in living well than in nationalism or conflict? And I wonder if this new generation doesn't pose a situation where we can foresee, through the appropriate steps in the future, some resolution to this difficult issue. Thank you.
Is there hope in the youth?
I'll just make one comment. Egypt, twice in 2 years, I'm not sure there's a precedent for this in modern times, as a consequence of demonstrations of popular will, mobilization of millions of people in the streets, changed governments twice with, I'll say, relatively little violence. The first time 800 Egyptians were killed, the next a lot more. But this is an extraordinary phenomenon. It's not just a new generation, but clearly they're very much a part of it. I mean, Mubarak's departure was made possible by the fact that you had enormous demonstrations. The military would not defend him. And Morsi's departure was made possible by more Egyptians out in the streets than voted for him, aided and abetted by the military. So this notion of public opinion is a very powerful force. The catch, of course, is that in this region, public opinion is not necessarily enlightened. The same mythologies and anti-Semitic tropes that existed in the older generation, even with social media, in fact, you could argue social media has, to some degree, facilitated it, exist there as well. So I come back to the truly depressing point that you have a region in which no one is going to be in charge. You excuse me, have to get used to a reality. Otherwise, go study another part of the world. If you're looking for certainty and solutions, instead of gray outcomes, find another place to analyze.
Elan, you have some
Not
thoughts
going to
on
find
this
it
issue.
here.
I want to amplify the point that came out. I think it's important to decouple the tools that social media provides for organizing people and for spreading the word and so on from what it is that people communicate through those tools. So sometimes you have people with better ideas organizing for better outcomes, but you as you put it in terms of mythologies and so on, it's a tool that can equally be used for propagating bad ideas. And you need only look at the way Al-Qaeda uses the internet to recruit and train people to see that, yes, it's a tool, could be used for evil, which highlights in a way, so, I mean, there's reason to think that the Boston bombers read one of the magazines that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula puts out, I believe, called Insight, which teaches how to make those kinds of bombs. Inspire, that's right. And there's recruitment videos and so on, and there's this whole lurid genre of online videos and chat boards and so on. But social media is a powerful tool, but to me this highlights the real obstacle, which is what are the ideas that are salient and that are having an impact on young people. And I think it's dangerous to assume that because people use Facebook, they're interested in technology and a good life. Some of them are. A lot of them here are. A lot of them take it for granted. But the real worry I have is that there are a whole generation who've grown up in this era of rising Islamist trend, both in Egypt and in the Palestinian areas in particular, where it's part of reality that you hear about suicide bombers. It's not an outrage. This is the way the world is. I was always, since birth, this is the reality, that it's not a new development. And people often live and think based on what they've experienced and only what they've experienced, not beyond, not history, not context. And that makes it very dangerous because it normalizes things that are way beyond the pale, right? To walk around and see posters of, what they call martyrs and see them celebrated as a normal thing. And what does that, we worry about video games in this country making young people desensitized to violence, and we see that in school. What does it mean if you see these posters and you hear about it on TV and your children's programming for under 5s have these kids dressed in suicide bombs? Right, and then you go on social media and you're completely awash with some of this stuff. That can really pervert people's thinking and value system. And I think that there's a real danger of that being magnified through these new tools that are so powerful in connecting people.
Thank you, Elan. This gentleman here in the tan jacket.
So I have a question for Daniel Pipes. So you're saying, that the Israelis have to defeat the Palestinians, but everything you said is totally abstract. They must defeat them. And it seems to me it's very different from World War II, where you had, you did have one group of people totally defeated, whereas here you have the whole rest of the Arab world, and they're going to say, no, you're not defeated. So what are they going to do? Give us some specifics. Don't just say they have to defeat them and everything will be okay.
By the Palestinians being defeated. What I mean is that the Palestinian vibrant dream of eliminating the Jewish state be crushed.
So how do you do it? Tell us how you do it.
You already asked that twice. It does not necessarily mean a military invasion, occupation, killings. In modern times, it's basically psychological. We lost in Vietnam not because we ran out of manpower or bullets, but because we ran out of will. We no longer had the will to go on. Likewise, say, the Soviets in Afghanistan. And what you have in the Arab-Israeli conflict now is a conflict of will. And as you correctly point out, the Palestinians have behind them a very large body of Arabs, Muslims, the left, who are encouraging them. This is not some obscure National Liberation Front in Africa. The Israelis, for their side, have also a substantial body behind them. So what does this mean? This means that the Israelis should, with our encouragement, take those steps which make it clear to the Palestinians that they have lost. In other words, that their dream of eliminating Israel is defunct. One instance of many might be the move of the American embassy to Jerusalem. This is a constant refrain, never acted upon, because anytime a politician says, I'm going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, his advisors come up and say, you don't really want to do that. It's going to lead to riots, and what's the point of it anyway? It's really just a matter of bureaucratic consistency. We have our embassy in the capital of every other state, so why shouldn't we in Israel? And, faced with the possible consequences, there's a faltering of the will, and it never happens. But if one saw it differently, as sending a signal to the Palestinians that Israel's here, Israel's permanent, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, it would send a signal. And there could be many other such signals concerning UNRWA, for example, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, concerning borders, concerning all sorts of things, where we help the Israelis send a signal to the Palestinians that they lost. And if you look back, you'll see, for example, between 2001 and 2003, Ariel Sharon, before his Gaza withdrawal, did engage in a variety of steps that caused the Palestinians to come to the conclusion that they were doing badly. And they were on a trajectory, which he then changed. They were on a trajectory that could have led to their concluding that they had lost, but he then didn't follow through. I would like to see Israelis, with our support, taking steps that cause the Palestinians to have the sense that their goal of eradicating the Jewish state is defunct.
Anyone else on what victory would look like? Or do we... Let's have another question, a couple more. I think this gentleman here with his... Yes. This gentleman here in the stripe. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's Vladimir Pismani, any negotiations, one of the main requirements of the so-called Palestinian side is the area totally cleared from Jewish population. It has its own terms. It's called Judenfrei. And world haven't heard it since the heroes, quote unquote, of the Nuremberg tribunal were hanged. And looks like that media doesn't pay attention on it, but this is something that, in the word of Mr. Tobin, court of international opinion should be up on their arms.
And what's the question?
The question is, do you think that to raise this question in negotiation will help to promote the negotiation?
Anybody understand that question or want to address it?
Well, I think one of the talking points about what an independent Palestinian state that would involve the withdrawal of various Israeli settlements, I think that, as Mahmoud Abbas said recently, in his Palestinian state of the future, there will be not one settlement, implying basically there will be not one Jew. So obviously Israelis, supporters of Israel say, well, yes, that is what he's proposing is a Judenfrei Palestinian state. Well, they have a Judenfrei Palestinian state in Gaza right now. The supporters of the problem is, as much as this can be highlighted, and this is sort of a talking point against the Palestinians, if no matter what happens in any peace agreement, the Israelis will certainly look to withdraw as Sharon did in Gaza, they will look to withdraw every single Jew from any area that is no longer under Israeli control, because they know that any Jews left behind in a Palestinian state will last as long as those greenhouses that were bought by American philanthropists from the Jewish farmers in Gaza for the use of the Palestinians, and we all know how long they lasted. They were smashed in a paroxysm of anger and rage, and celebration. So, any Palestinian state, any Palestinian entity that is created as a result of any peace process is, alas, going to be one where there are no Jews, and Israel will remain a multi-ethnic society where there are Arabs and Arabs with voting rights. That's just the nature of the two parties.
We are out of time. I want to thank our panel, Aaron Miller, Daniel Pipes, Jonathan Tobin, Elan Journo. Thank you.